people want to waste their time talking about, ooh, don't say that word. You aren't a doctor or a therapist. And our legal and judicial systems, they're designed to punish, not prevent. Now, one thing I know about narcissism is that there's a lot of myths and misunderstandings floating around about it. So we're going to be talking about what some of these myths, or at least exaggerations about narcissism. And today we're going to take on one that a lot of us, it's sort of a half-true myth. And this half-true myth is that narcissists are always men. Okay? So in this series about myths, it's really going to be about debunking these myths because I think it leads people to think too simplistically. Now, the prototypical image, let's face it, okay? The prototypical, stereotypical image of narcissism or narcissist is of the grandiose male narcissist. If you were to close your eyes or to choose an image, if I showed you a series of photos of who is a narcissist in a series of images, I'm guessing you would likely choose the image of someone who looked masculine, well-groomed, attractive by societal standards, maybe implied to have money, likely of majority race relative to whatever majority race is wherever you are in the world. But what's interesting is there's a danger to this kind of profiling. Because maybe you are right, but it means that you may miss toxic and narcissistic relationships in people because they don't fit the profile of being a man who looks a certain way. Now, interestingly, when it comes to grandiose narcissism, the research on gender and narcissism is pretty clear. Narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder, in general terms, are significantly more common in men when compared to women. This research has largely focused, the gender difference research in narcissism has largely focused on grandiose narcissism and often uses a questionnaire called the Narcissistic Personality Inventory. It was interesting, there was one study that was something we call a meta-analysis, which is like a review by someone named Emily Grijalva and her colleagues. It was published in 2015. And it highlighted the more pronounced gender differences on the elements of grandiose narcissism, specifically the exploitativeness and the entitlement factor, and the leadership and authority factor of that narcissistic personality scale. And her team found that much higher scores in men than in women. So in simple terms, in their research, men were showing that they were more willing to cop to taking advantage of other people, believing that the rules don't apply to them, gravitating to leadership, and basically wanting to be the boss. This is not a newsflash. This is what most of us assume. So when it comes to covert narcissism, which is likely to be just as prevalent as grandiose narcissism, Grijalva's data suggests that there's actually no difference between genders. And interestingly, that's really consistent with clinical observational data as well, that we see similarities in terms of when people show up with the various qualities that we see in covert narcissism, that sense of victimization, sort of a sullen, resentful presentation, very anxious and sometimes even dysphoric and irritable presentation, sensitivity to criticism, rejection sensitivity, persecutory ideation, passive-aggressive rage, dysregulated displays of anger and abandonment fears. Those are all part of covert narcissism. And so because that presentation is something that women would bring in, less likely that maybe that big, grandiose, malignant presentation, but that covert presentation, because many people don't associate narcissism with women, they think of it as a characteristic that's really largely in men, it may end up getting missed. And then the clinician not only may try to treat this person for anxiety or depression, the people around a woman who's showing those patterns may also not identify it as narcissism, and then just sort of keep wondering, why do we keep having the same kind of conversation over and over again? Now, there are different reasons given for these gender disparities on narcissism. One comes from the fact that genders are socialized differently. Others offer up theories that are called social dominance theories. But we do socialize people differently on the basis of gender, in terms of how power, dominance, entitlement, emotions, All of these things are valued and regarded. There's differences. We are more likely to accept grandiose and posturing behavior in men and boys relative to other genders. We are also less likely to judge overt anger as severely in men and boys than we are in other genders. All of this can create clearer paths forward to the development and expression of narcissistic patterns in men compared to other genders. However, perhaps as developmental trends shift, let's say we keep shifting to a world where children are gradually socialized similarly on the basis of gender, then some of this may change. My guess is that when it comes to grandiose narcissism, these shifts to more gender equality on the basis of grandiose narcissism may take several generations. But let's just say I know enough people out there who have had narcissistic mothers, narcissistic ex-female partners, and narcissistic ex-wives to let you know that narcissism is alive and well in women. But that piece about covert narcissism is really, to me, the most important part of this conversation. While covert narcissism isn't what we classically think of as narcissism, and it doesn't have the grandiose and malignant top notes, it still causes tremendous harm in close relationships. And in fact, it may be even more confusing to the people in these relationships. The chronic need of the covert narcissist to frame themselves as a victim can be an even more robust gaslighting experience for the people who are caught in these relationships. In addition, because people with covert narcissistic presentation can often look to other people as sad and lost and anxious, a whole range of neurotic spectrum symptoms that are seen in covert narcissism. People in relationships with them want to help them. They want to fix them. They want to support them, and they want to reassure them, and they want to coddle them. It can take people months and even years to figure out the toll that relationships with covert narcissists are taking on them. And the passive-aggressive rage can actually be more psychologically exhausting than the screamy, yelly, grandiose rage, especially if a person stuck in one of these relationships feels guilty at calling the covert narcissist out because they seem so fragile. So that gender similarity on covert narcissism highlights the need for all of us to see narcissism more holistically, to not lose sight of the equally damaging covert patterns on the mental health of those around the narcissistic person, and to recognize that when looking at this subtype when it comes to gender, it's definitely a coin flip, equally distributed across genders. And again, as a disclaimer, I'm very aware that I'm using binary gendered language in this video. At this time, the research largely still uses that framework. It takes a minute for empirical research to catch up. And maybe we'd be better suited to focusing, I don't know, on masculine leaning patterns that we tend to see more in grandiose narcissism, and narcissistic patterns that appear to be equivalently present in both genders, like covert narcissism. As research in this field evolves, more research addressing gender in a more inclusive manner, we hope will be seen. And for all of you out there who are in very difficult relationships with someone who identifies as a woman, and you think, nah, women can't be narcissists, that's all about men, think again. Sadly, this personality style doesn't know from gender. And it's important you be aware of this so you don't miss the red flags before it is too late. So regarding this myth that all narcissists are men, not true. Plenty of narcissistic women out there. And when it comes to covert narcissism, just as likely to be a woman as it would be to be a man. So I hope that addresses that myth. And though, gentlemen, you may want to clean up your act on the grandiose narcissism because you're definitely winning there, and on the malignant narcissism. But with the covert narcissism, the women have caught up. Now, I know I've talked about this before, but let me reiterate it. It's honestly the biggest rookie mistake people make when it comes to understanding narcissism. And it actually shows you how you know someone is a newbie to the narcissism world. They think that narcissism is just self-love, preening in the mirror, right? Now, part of this error comes from the origin of this term and the myth of Narcissus. This simple version that people believe is that Narcissus was a beautiful young man who fell in love with his own reflection in a lake. That's like saying Jurassic Park was a movie about dinosaur bones. It's a tiny piece of the story, but there's a lot more to it than that. Without getting into the finer points of Ovid and other ancient writers who wrote about Narcissus, the myth actually basically boils down to a story about a beautiful boy who grew up into a beautiful man. And in one version, the nymph Echo, and Echo had her own problems because the queen of the gods, Hera, had cursed Echo to never be able to speak her own words. So she was cursed to forever repeat the words she last heard and never really be able to communicate. So Echo sees Narcissus and she falls in love with him. But she is unable to share her feelings because the last words she hears are just repeated. And basically he tells her to leave him alone. Nemesis, who is the goddess of revenge, saw this whole thing go down and wasn't happy about it, thought Narcissus was being a jerk to Echo. So she punished Narcissus by luring him to get some water. And when he saw his reflection, she cursed him to fall in love with it. He couldn't be pulled away from his own image. And once Narcissus realized that the love he had for his reflection could never be returned, could never be reciprocated, he was consumed by his own passion for himself, and actually then all of that passion turned into a white flower that to this day we call the Narcissus. In other versions, Narcissus was cursed to commit suicide because he wasn't able to have his reflection and love it as a person, and yet another version, he falls in love with his twin sister and then commits suicide. No matter how you slice up the story of Narcissus, it's actually a very cursed story. And every version of this myth comes down to the same ending, that actually falling in love with yourself the way Narcissus did, instead of falling in love with another person, is a curse. And ultimately, really what all these stories are saying is that narcissism is actually a curse. Because of the simple part of the story that everyone ran with, the falling in love with his own reflection part, the story of Narcissus has always boiled down to these simplistic tropes about, like I said, a person who stares in the mirror a lot or talks about how great they are. Yeah, some narcissistic people, particularly the grandiose ones, are externally seemingly shameless in their self-promotion. But using that cheap cologne analogy I've used in the past, the shameless self-promoting swagger, grandiosity, and arrogance are all covering up, like cheap cologne, that deep insecurity and inadequacy. That so much effort is going into protecting the self, not loving the self, but protecting it, that they're never really able to love someone else. And ultimately, that is the tragic story of Narcissus. Arrogance, then the cursed incapacity to love another that results in self-destruction. The myth that narcissism is self-love is actually a really dangerous myth, because it results in other people almost thinking of this as harmless egotism, grandiose fluff, posturing and preening and just wanting to be pretty. It misses the toxic stuff, the entitlement, the rejection sensitivity, the rage, the manipulation, the incapacity for intimacy. And even the Greeks got that part of the story right? The lack of empathy, the stuff that hurts. Interestingly, in all of the Greek myths, Narcissus was not a nice guy. He was always boastful and proud and very snobby and always rejecting other people. Nobody was ever good enough for him. But the gods thought that arrogance, that hubris as it was, they didn't like that, so they thought it deserved to be punished, and so they did punish him. Ironically, maybe there was less enabling in that myth about Narcissus than there is now of narcissistic people. Because of all the enabling in the world, few put the narcissistic people's feet to the fire and really force them to have the reckoning. Our rules, our laws, our ethics, our culture of forgiveness, and way too many second chances means that in the modern era, the myth of Narcissus would have consisted of him rejecting everyone and hurting everyone with little consequence. But that's not what happened in those myths, is it? So the idea that narcissism is self-love is sort of the opposite of the truth. In fact, narcissism is a masterclass in self-loathing, in self-devaluation, in inadequacy, shame, and insecurity. The more the bluff and bravado a person has, the greater their level of insecurity. People who are excellent and good and secure, they don't talk about their excellence. They're humble, and they know they're good. People who truly love themselves are actually really kind to other people because they're never pulling on this dry, empty well that the narcissists come across. Self-love, sadly, is pretty rare in our world, but the people who have it right are the ones who respect other people, including themselves, and are kind to other people because it comes automatically. So let's break out of this myth that somehow narcissism has anything to do with self-love. It's actually the opposite. The Greeks got it right thousands of years ago, and we really, really need to revise our versions of narcissism to really reflect how much it is about self-loathing, inadequacy, shame, all covered up by behaviors that hurt other people. So let's take on the biggest myth of all. Narcissism is an illness, or it's a diagnosis. Now, this is a common one. And in fact, it is often used to shame survivors of narcissistic abuse. For example, they'll say, well, you can't say that that person is narcissistic. You aren't a doctor. You can't diagnose them. You can't say if this person has this illness. How do you know they have narcissistic personality disorder? I have said this so many times that I know I'm being repetitive, but I'm going to say it again, because it just keeps coming up over and over again. When I talk to clients, when I do consultation, over and over. The word, the term, the concept of narcissism, it is not diagnostic, it is descriptive. I have had people tell me that their lawyers, their mediators, their physicians, their therapists, their human resource departments, their family members, and or their friends have roundly criticized them or questioned them for using this term, saying that, well, we don't want to diagnose someone or use a diagnosis word, and then they will view that person who's already experiencing all the fallout and the abuse of the narcissistic relationship may now be labeled as the difficult or the judgy or the labely one. The whole history of this word narcissism is a bit complicated and probably beyond the scope of this video. Actually, uses of this term, narcissism, interestingly, in the late 19th century, use it to describe excessive masturbation, in essence, using the self for sexual pleasure. In the early 20th century, I always looked to people like Otto Rank as one of the ones who brought this term into the realm of psychology and psychiatry, and in his writings actually brought it to more of the grandiose and superficial manifestations of excessive vanity and self-validation. Freud wrote the seminal work on narcissism, and from there on in, this term was peppered throughout the psychoanalytic literature, with major work being done by folks like Kernberg and Kohut. It wasn't until 1980 in the DSM-3 that narcissistic personality disorder even showed up in any diagnostic manual. And who the hell knows what these people were diagnosed with before them? Probably a whole bunch of other stuff. There is a tricky history around equating narcissism with illness. Interestingly, for example, in the domestic and family violence world, advocates and scholars in that world haven't been fans of it. They feel that it gives the perpetrator an out to call them narcissistic, that they are sick. The corollary to them is that if you say someone's narcissistic and it's a disorder, that means a therapy exists, but as we know, it really doesn't. And then there's a belief that the idea that the abuser is ill, that can then impede policies and programs that are supposed to protect the people who actually experience the domestic violence, not the abusers. And I 1000% understand the concern of those who work in the domestic violence world. But since there really isn't an efficacious treatment for narcissistic personality that can be easily scaled up, then it really is an issue without a fix, an illness without anything that has a cure, if it was an illness, and it's not. Ultimately and simply, narcissism is a personality style. It's what we may call a maladaptive personality style, meaning that it is not healthy or good for the person or the people around the person. It is also what we call rigid, inflexible, and pervasive, meaning it cuts across all situations in their lives, and it's stable. So this is it. And I'm not going to belabor the whole lack of empathy, entitlement, blah, blah, blah. You know the laundry list. But when people keep having this argument that narcissism is a diagnosis and people shouldn't be diagnosing people they haven't met, and they start getting all gold water on my ass, I don't buy it. It's a descriptive term. And by making it about that whole diagnostic argument, we lose a critical opportunity to have the bigger conversation here. Narcissism as a personality style is very interesting in the mental health realm, right? Because it may very well harm other people much more than it harms the person who has it. This makes it a unique challenge in mental health. Usually we approach mental health and description of mental health from the point of view of what is happening to the person with the pattern. For example, the struggles of a person living with anxiety, but not as much as how it impacts others. Maybe some of this work has been done in, for example, substance use research, where the impact of a substance use disorder on their families and partners has been researched. But I must say, even some of that research and theorizing has often pathologized the people in the substance users, or at least some of the people in the substance users' lives, as codependents. You kind of can't win. Covert, or what's called vulnerable narcissism, clearly causes more clinical distress for the narcissistic person than the other forms like grandiose narcissism. But all of the narcissistic patterns generally impact other people more. And this is where the mental health field comes up short. We are absolutely loath to talk about what to do when one person's mental health issues are causing major distress for another person. People then still get lost on wanting to focus in mental health, want to focus on helping the narcissistic person rather than the person being affected. When we have the wrong conversations about nomenclature and fears about name calling, like I said, we lose the opportunity to have the bigger conversation, which we need to have at this point in history. Narcissistic personalities are wreaking havoc in our world. Our world is becoming more violent, more dangerous, more divided, more polarized, more economically unstable, and more mentally unhealthy. And a fair amount of this can be traced to interactions with folks who have these personality styles holding disproportionate power in society. It's sad because through narcissism and understanding it, we really do have a roadmap, a blueprint, a template to understand these societal problems. And yet, people want to waste their time talking about, ooh, don't say that word. You aren't a doctor or a therapist. And our legal and judicial systems, they're designed to punish, not prevent. So the attitude is, we don't really care about their personality until they kill or harm someone. That's a pretty darn problematic policy position if you are on the receiving end of that violence or abuse. Others get lost in the idea that the narcissistic patterns, the lack of empathy, the entitlement, the arrogance, the rage, the dysregulation, the reactivity, the control, the victimhood, the emotional contempt, that these are all byproducts of trauma, that these are related to attachment issues. They may be. But what does that mean? A person with a bad history gets to run roughshod over other people's lives? In larger terms, it speaks to a dearth of access to mental health, a need to address societal issues such as parenting and child abuse and protection of children. But writing of narcissism as a post-traumatic illness, which then means that we can't really talk about it, right? Oh, don't say that because it's not very fair or nice. Well, if you cut the opportunity to talk about it, honestly, that's That's not very fair or nice. Narcissism, as I see it right here from my seat, it's nothing more than a framework. A framework to understand these patterns and make them understandable, predictable, and help people cope, set boundaries, and stop blaming themselves. And also to inform society that these aren't people who are just grandstanding and showing off and just a little bit insecure. In many cases, they are downright dangerous and are making self-serving decisions that affect and potentially harm many, or maybe even just a few, and that's still too many. Narcissistic personality disorder. Let's take a minute to be clear on that. Yeah, we'll call that an illness. It's a personality disorder with a prevalence of 3 to 6% depending on the data. Most people don't get diagnosed with this because people with these personalities don't tend to go or stay in therapy. And many people with the illness who show up to therapy don't get the diagnosis because lots of people who give the diagnoses feel it's too stigmatizing or don't understand it, or our diagnostic framework is still too grandiose. And even if they do get diagnosed, it's an illness without a meaningful treatment. There was discussion right down to the wire in the formulation of the most recent diagnostic manual, the DSM, on whether narcissistic personality disorder should have even been included. Let's stop stymieing this conversation by saying, don't talk about narcissism because you don't have the right to diagnose someone. Calling someone narcissistic, as I've said time and time again, is no different than calling them stubborn or silly or friendly. It's just a description. If you tell me I'm going to have a meeting with a stubborn person, then I'm prepared for a tough negotiation. If you tell me I'm going to have a meeting with a friendly person, I may be prepared for something more gregarious and full of equanimity. If you tell me I am having a meeting with a narcissistic person, I am prepared for a lack of empathy, entitlement, and arrogance. It's a framework, and one that if people could really get, we could be more savvy as to how we hire people, vote for people, fall in love with them, how we work with them, and how we simply be with them. So let's break out of this thinking, folks. It's not an illness. It's a pattern. I wouldn't be surprised as the diagnostic manual evolves to decide they're not even going to call it a personality disorder anymore. Can narcissism change? Can a narcissistic personality shift and change? Because that's the myth. A lot of people out there say, oh, of course it can change. All personalities can change. This myth is an oldie, right? It's a classic. It's the reason that most people get stuck in these messes in the first place. The myth is that narcissism can change. The myth is that narcissism can completely turn around and we can set people free from it. Maybe if we love the person enough, or address their core wounds, or figure out how to best talk to them, or maybe things will start working out for them, and then their personality will shift. They're just grumpy because life's not going the way they want. Let's start with the idea. Let's talk about what change really is, right? Because there's change, and then there's change. I don't know, if I move my car 2 feet forward in the driveway, I suppose I've moved it, but it doesn't really change anything, does it? Another car won't fit behind it, and most people wouldn't notice that it moved 2 feet. But literally speaking, it moved 2 feet. That's a change, right? And that right there is one of the issues that causes a lot of debate. What does change really mean? And how much change is enough to be meaningful? This is where the researchers and the therapists and the people experiencing narcissistic abuse will never be on the same page. When we do research on change, things that may show up as sort of being, I guess they change statistically in a meaningful way, they have little meaning in real life. For example, a person's score, I don't know, on some kind of emotional regulation test or test on insight or test on narcissism, I suppose maybe that could shift a little. But the people around them aren't noticing any meaningful change. They're still gaslighting, they're still manipulative. They're just still out there causing problems. There's still rage, all of those things. Maybe there's fewer episodes. The narcissistic person may catch it earlier. They may even apologize. But it still happens. Is that change? That's a subjective question. Therapists in general do not like the idea of talking about people not changing. I don't know, maybe it's a bad business model, right? It's like saying, hey, I'm a mechanic, and there are some cars out there I can't fix. You don't want to say that. It feels kind of bleak and hopeless. Many therapists take umbrage at this idea that narcissism is a pretty unchangeable kind of a personality style. And they still work with people saying, oh, maybe we could figure out a way to get you there. And then there are those who are experiencing narcissistic abuse who desperately want change to be possible so they can maintain the relationship. But they've tried for years. They've tried everything. They've gotten nowhere. And what happens with most survivors of narcissistic abuse is that they believe there's something wrong with them themselves, because everyone can change, right? And if they're not changing, they think I'm not worth changing for, but maybe they change for someone else. I have a unique perch on this because I've worked with a lot of narcissistic clients in therapy. And listen, I'm the first one to know, maybe I am a shit therapist and that's why people aren't changing. But let's just say I'm a decent therapist, right? So if I even gave myself a little benefit of the doubt, I have to say in working with narcissistic clients, we don't make much progress. And I see why that is. It comes down to people who are narcissistic having zero tolerance for stress or frustration or disappointment or criticism. I will see that just from one week to the next, a narcissistic person can go from well-regulated to rageful and vindictive. And when I point out the difference to them in 1 week, what happened? You changed so much. They'll start to rage at me. And if they're raging at me, I can't imagine the rage they must be manifesting to those close to them. And usually the only reason their rage was worse the second week was because their stressor came along. There are people out there who claim to have the solution to it all. I don't see it. I don't even think an intensive inpatient therapy would do it, because then the narcissistic person would still ultimately have to leave that intensive inpatient setting and be out in the world with all of its stresses and shame and disappointment. There are no magic spells, no magical trauma therapies, no magic mushrooms or other potions or lotions that make narcissism go away. Pushing back from an antagonistic personality style such as narcissism, for a person to do that means making a lifelong commitment to being mindfully aware of other people and coming from a place of empathy or compassion, because that's the rub. People who are narcissistic actually know what societally preferred behavior looks like. And sometimes in their contempt, they will label things like respect and compassion as weak or foolish or lame, or whatever words they can use to diminish empathy and compassion and respect. But the dysregulation, the impulsivity, and the oppositionality of narcissism, coupled with the lack of self-reflective capacity, means that when things are going beautifully or the way a narcissistic person wants, then they're actually able to play at the empathy and kindness game. They're able to look regulated and even play the I'm interested in you game. But when a narcissistic person is experiencing any sense of threat or things in life aren't going the way they want, they can become very reactive, and they're not able to inhibit their often cruel responses. It's for this reason that when people suspect that they are narcissistic themselves and ask me what they can do to change, I tell them, it's really all mindfulness all the time. That they always need to think about every word they say and how it could affect someone else, no matter how upset the narcissistic person is feeling. Let's face it, that's a tall order for any of us. But it's all but impossible for somebody who's narcissistic, who will often think, well, that's ridiculous. I can't do that. I have read many, many case reports over the year. These are published articles about one or two people, for example, who might have narcissistic personality disorder. And the article will go on to talk about how they were treated and the changes that these people were able to make. In most of these cases, these were people who had access to highly trained therapists. They had once or twice weekly sessions for at least 18 months or longer. This ain't happening, not in America. And since narcissistic people are about 60% more likely to drop out of therapy, even with all of that therapy in place, the first time the therapist goes hard and attempts to make them keep it real, they aren't likely to come back in. So there goes that chance to change. And anybody who can have that much therapy anyhow has a lot of money. Has it happened? Have people improved? I'm sure. I'm sure these cases have been there. And significant change like this is a unicorn. It's definitely not something someone can plan around. And the fact is, the published articles are about the successes. I recognize that narcissism has lots of what we call etiologies or origins: early life trauma, abuse, loss, attachment issues, emotionally unavailable parents, intergenerational patterns, spoiled kids, kids who are valued too much for their abilities or their appearance than for their inner worlds, attachment issues, you name it. And while some people with those difficult backstories may develop narcissistic personalities, most will not. The lack of self-reflective capacity and the tendency to blame other people means that people who are narcissistic will never recognize their contribution to an interpersonal situation or any situation in life, and will quickly blame others so they can avoid the shame. Personality is tough. It's a bit of a psychological fingerprint, and while there can be a little movement in some personality styles, some styles, antagonistic personality styles like narcissism, are very rigid, and they are not amenable to change. Life is not Beauty and the Beast, where love saves a raging beast and turns him into a sweetheart. It's not all those feel-good movies in which love and inspiration turn someone hard-hearted into a big sweetheart. It just doesn't work that way. I wish it did. I really did. We would save so many broken hearts, so many broken families, and so many broken dreams. And frankly, save the narcissists from their broken spirits too. But alas, this is not a pattern that's easily amenable to change. I really do applaud people out there with narcissistic personality styles who say, I want to do the work. I say to you, by all means, do the work. It's an uphill slog, but it's worth doing. For those of you in relationships with narcissistic people, doing the work is their responsibility. You can't help them with this, no more than you could do a kid's homework and think they're going to learn. These are their miles to walk. And listen, I'd love to be out of a job. I'd love it if people could do the work and push back on this. But by and large, the people who do make the commitment are very rare, and most of you experiencing narcissistic abuse are not likely to experience significant change in the narcissistic people who populate your life.